We'll start. Yeah, I think good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to our guest speaker, all the way from the United States, cartoonist Andy Warner. Andy Warner is an American cartoonist and a digital artist who creates nonfiction comics. I met Andy in Bahrain at the comics convention in May 2014. It was a convention organized by the US Embassy to encourage young artists to create comics and cartoons. Andy gave a great workshop about how to create comics, especially how to use certain pens and brushes. I still remember the brush pen, the brush pen, the one that you gave me, the Sakura, the Sakura brush pen. I learned a lot from Andy. I learned skills that I still use and remember. Andy is the master of digital art, especially using Wacoms and iPads. So it's your time to learn from Andy. Thank you for coming, and please go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm trying to get back into, the presenter mode that I just lost. How do I get into that? Not full screen, just presenter. Is that sharing it? Here.
It's not, I guess.
Okay, so let me do this.
Yeah, it is now, yes.
Okay, so it is now?
Yes, yes.
Totally. All right, fantastic. Okay, so making comics digitally. So I have been making comics entirely digitally since 2007, when a motorcycle ran into me as I was biking down the street, and it shattered my drawing arm in 3 places. And doctors had to reconstruct it with screws. And at that point, I actually wasn't a working cartoonist. I was a graphic designer, but I was still relying on this arm for my paycheck, for my income. And I was doing a lot of traditional tool work at that point. And so I realized that I needed to learn digital tools fast, because in the 6 months that it took my arm to regrow, its bone connections, I had to use my left hand to draw. And digital tools gave me the capability to draw while I was handicapped in such a way, because it gives you this control that you can zoom in to like 12,000%. You can draw this agonizingly slow line. You can undo the line and redo it until it's perfect. And so through that was when I first learned how to use digital tools, and I've never looked back since. Basically, ever since then, I've switched tools. I've gone through a lot of different ones. I started with a little Wacom bamboo tablet that was plugged into my ancient MacBook. And now I'll get into my current rig, but I've gone through the ringer. So who am I? I am an author. I've put out 3 books so far, all of them drawn digitally. Again, I basically never touch pen to paper except when I'm writing to-do lists. Like I keep a little notebook around that, is my like Wednesday to-do list, and I doodle in that occasionally. But soup to nuts, all of my work is all drawn on screens. And I actually don't wear eyeglasses. My eyes are fine. So you can stare at screens all day for like, since 2007, and your eyes will survive. So I have 3 books out so far, all nonfiction. Nonfiction is my specialty in comics, whether it's journalism, memoir, history, whatever. I also work as an editor for the Nib, which is a nonfiction comics site, and I contribute to them too, and I publish widely online. So I work both for print, and I work for digitally in a lot of different formats. And there's a lot of different hardware setups to make digital comics. The one that I use is Mac. I use a MacBook Pro, but pretty much any Mac will do after, I think it's 2018, and iPad, and running a program called Sidecar that then mirrors the screens over. I'll talk about that in a minute. Another hardware setup that some friends of mine use is a Windows 2-in-1 computer, and there's a ton of these. I don't know the Windows ecosystem as well. I'll mainly be talking about Mac hardware, but I know plenty of professional cartoonists that work for like Peanut Studio and stuff like that that use Windows machines. Macs are slightly more industry standard, at least here in North America. Another possibility is iPad only. This didn't used to be possible, but in the last few years, the apps that are available on the iPad and the actual computing power of the iPads themselves with a new generation of iPad Pros has gotten to the level where you can pretty much put together a comic digitally and do almost all of your professional work using just an iPad. You'll need some peripherals like Bluetooth keyboards and mice and stuff like that to do the typing and not kill your fingers, but it's a really portable setup. It is limited, and I'll talk about that too. And then the last one is a Mac or a PC and a Cintiq or equivalent. And so you could either have the Cintiq that has the touch screen, like the iPad, and then it basically functions in a similar way to Sidecar, where it offers an extension of the screen. Or you could have a kind of older technology, which is a cheaper entry point, like a bamboo type of tablet. And those you're drawing on the tablet, not on the screen itself. And there's a little bit of a disconnect as you do that. You'll notice that if you ever try to draw a perfect circle, it's very easy to draw a circle on a screen or on a piece of paper because you're holding the pen and you see where the line is coming up. And it's very difficult to do that on a tablet where you're drawing down here and you're looking at the screen. So you can see how it affects your line quality with that. It's not, again, it's not the end of the world. I spent, I don't think I got a touch screen drawing tool until 2011, maybe, something like that. And so I spent a few years making, professional grade comics, professional grade graphic design using only a bamboo tablet. It's just quicker to use a touch screen. It's more expensive though. So my current setup is a 2019 MacBook Pro, which I have up on a laptop stand. That helps it with cooling a little bit because I end up running programs that often are doing 3D rendering in browser windows as I'm working on my iPad Pro because I'm looking at reference angles and stuff like that. And so it can actually put this, pretty powerful laptop through its paces sometimes when I'm using all my programs at once and have like 80 browser windows. And then I'm actually drawing on an iPad Pro 2018, the first generation. A few generations have come out since then. The chips have changed and they've actually gotten a lot better, but this machine works fine for me. But when it breaks, I'll replace it. And you can connect either via Bluetooth in this way called Sidecar. That's essentially like AirDrop, if you've ever used that with an iPhone and a Mac or an iPhone and an iPad. Apple has a proprietary way that its devices talk to each other using Bluetooth. And so they use this to run this program called Sidecar that extends the iPad into an extra screen for a Mac. And you can actually make it a primary screen too. I've seen setups where people buy like a Mac Mini and an iPad Pro, and that's just their screen. And then the Mac Mini is running the iPad Pro, running Mac OS on it. And there's all sorts of YouTube videos that you can watch about that stuff. It will go faster if you plug it in via USB-C into the device that's actually powering the iPad, just because it's able to always run more data over a thick USB-C cable than it is over the air, however Bluetooth magic works. And then I'm also, because I'm using actually Adobe Photoshop on my iPad Pro. I'm running it on the Mac OS system on the iPad screen. And so if you've ever used Adobe Photoshop, which I'll show you the UI of later, it's very complicated. There's a lot of tiny things, especially the desktop version, which is what I'm using. And so having a Bluetooth mouse next to it allows me to get those really fine granular points hit on the screen, like where you need to select text when you're working, when you need to hit an exact button, whatever. And so the ability to just drop the Apple Pencil back on the magnetic thing, hit the Bluetooth mouse immediately right there, makes for very quick computing. Moving the laptop above and then having a Bluetooth keyboard down below gets the laptop's touchpad out of my wrist area. And then that Bluetooth keyboard is basically always being used for keyboard shortcuts. So if you work digitally, keyboard shortcuts, no matter what program you're using, are like hardwired into your brain. So whatever your dominant writing hand is, if you're right-handed, if you're left-handed, that's going to be your stylus hand, and then your off hand is your keyboard hand. And so if you're working just on a touchscreen, like an iPad or a detached Windows 2-in-1, I don't think Chrome tablets or anything like that can run these drawing apps powerfully, yeah. But often your hand, these apps will have a little thing built in where there's, you know, a thing you can touch and it brings up a bunch of options. It's because your offhand, basically, what makes digital tools so powerful is that you have the selection thing and then your offhand is the complicator. So it can, you know, switch between tools, it can change brush sizes. And as you learn your tools more and more, all this stuff just becomes really, really rote. I'll talk about programs later and staying on top of technology. This is something to remember, is that it's actually hard to unlearn programs. So I use Photoshop, not actually because it's the best comics drawing app anymore. It isn't, and I'll talk about that, but because it's what I've been using since I was 14, and it's burned into my brain. The way that it works, I can work incredibly fast in it. So there's a, you know, learning curve to all these things. You'll start out slow and then it'll burn into your brain, but be careful which app you spend the time learning because it'll be the one you stick with. So other useful stuff that I find is a two-fingered drawing glove. So this becomes useful when it's hot, when it's humid, things like that. Your hardware will start to get a little fritzy. It's an unfortunate thing. Air conditioning can help with it, fans can help with it, but another thing that really helps with it is a two-fingered drawing glove, because basically what happens a lot of the time is that the inputs start getting weird. And on all the stuff, whether it's an iPad, whether it's a Wacom, Cintiq, whether it's, there's all these other brands of Cintiq clones now that you can check out on Amazon that are even cheaper than Cintiq. Some of them work, some of them don't. No matter what they are, they all have this problem where they're supposed to just register the pen or just register touch, but if your hand gets sweaty down here, it'll trigger it with your wrist. And so what the two-finger drawing glove does is it basically covers all the parts that could touch the screen. They cost about like $3 to $5 on Amazon. And so those never input on it. The only things that input are the pen and then the three fingers that you use to pinch, zoom, do whatever the iPad or Wacom specific gestural stuff is. I also find podcasts or music very, very useful when working digitally, because one of the downsides of working digitally is that you're basically working in front of the device that is also your portal to the most interesting part of the world, which is the raw human brain that is the internet. Like, you know, you can just open a browser window and fall down into a Wikipedia hole, or open Twitter, or check what your friends are doing on Facebook, and it's right there. Like, you can't check out like you can with a pen and paper. And so how I do that is I turn on podcasts, and I can't do it while I'm thumbnailing or while I'm writing. I listen to music because I'm thinking about words. And then when I'm inking or I'm coloring, and listen to podcasts because I'm working in, you know, pure craft basically. And that allows me to turn off the part of my brain that would normally be looking for some sort of input that, you know, it's keeps me from looking over to the other screen. And then the last thing is an external laptop battery, because with this setup, you can actually go on the road wherever. You can work from the beach. Traditionally, if you were working digitally, you would have been chained to your computer because these tools required a lot of computing to run, and Photoshop wasn't available on things like the iPad. But these days, a lot of that has changed, and laptops are a lot more powerful. The programs take a lot less computing to run because a lot of that's offloaded into the cloud. And things like the iPad or the Cintiq Companion are actually really powerful computers in their own right. And so I would really recommend that as a digital artist, you take advantage of that and go outside and work outside. I spent a lot of the spring working outside on the beach. I would go for a hike on a mountain and then hike for 45 minutes, stop at a table, work for 6 hours because I had an external battery, you know, at a picnic table. And all of this rig is designed that it breaks down to about like maybe 5 or 6 pounds that fits in a backpack. Seriously, get outside. Just because you work digitally doesn't mean that you have to stay inside. That's one of the wonderful things about the modern era. So programs to make digital comics. The old school one, sort of the big boy in the room, is Photoshop. That's available for Mac and PC, and it's also available on iPad OS. There's also Clip Studio Paint, and I'll get more granularly into detail about all of these. Clip Studio Paint, which is available for Mac or PC and iPad. And lastly, there's Procreate, which is only available for iPad. There's also a ton more programs. There's Affinity Photo, there's like a billion programs, because everybody for years has been trying to make a Adobe Photoshop killer. And there's a lot of good programs out there, but some of them get abandoned partway through, or the community base isn't big enough and they stop growing. It's just not it's sort of an industry standard thing. These three are the ones that made it out of the land of either Photoshop killers or our Photoshop themselves. People actually use these. So using Adobe Photoshop, this is mine. This is what I use every day, 8 to 9 hours a day. So the pros are that it's industry standard. There's a system now with cloud PSDs where now that Photoshop is built, now that Adobe has built a somewhat working iPad app, you can actually have these documents that are almost like a Dropbox document or a Google Drive document where it's editable on both your Photoshop on your home PC, it's editable on the iPad, it's editable on your friend's Mac if you share it with them. It's actually a really good system. It's built on good architecture and it works, which is always somewhat surprising with Adobe. It has a really good text editor, which as a cartoonist that works primarily in and nonfiction is really vital for me because I'm always editing. I am writing and rewriting constantly. When I'm working as an editor, I'm asking for rewrites constantly. And so that means that I'm working with digital fonts a lot. Not every cartoonist works with digital fonts. Some people only hand draw their stuff. That's fine. One of the nice things about working digitally is that you have this power to make a handwriting font or to use somebody else's, and then you can actually edit without it being a huge hassle like it used to be. Photoshop is a good text editor. It's why a lot of people use it. By the way, when I mean industry standard, that's a big thing. So if you got commissioned to do a book or you got commissioned to do some work for a graphic design agency or something like that, you would be generally expected to be handing in Photoshop documents, so PSDs. So the file format that this outputs is what everybody expects basically to receive. And so when there's text in a Photoshop document, and I open it up in Photoshop and I click on it, I can edit that text if somebody sent it to me. And it's full featured. It has like a billion features that I never use. That's also one of its cons. So it wasn't actually built for comics. It was built for a bunch of different things. And that can mean that it can be sometimes frustrating to use. It can update in unexpected ways. Things will work fine for a while and then an update will break them unexpectedly. And cartoonists hate that. It's got slow updates. It doesn't respond to its community very well. Adobe is just kind of this behemoth that's been around forever and it's kind of had a monopoly forever, and they act like it. An example of that is their iPad app. It took them years to get one out, even though all the cartoonists had already switched over to iPads because of their ease of use with Macs, which they were already using. Finally, they came out with one and it was broken. They finally updated it enough where it works okay. I use it sometimes, but I still basically just use Sidecar, mirroring the full Adobe program onto my iPad. And also it has a subscription model, which sucks. I don't like recommending products with subscription models because they're like recommending a leech, but it's the only way that they offer it. And I subscribe to it because again, it's industry standard and I need to use it. I've also been using it since I was 14. So why use Sidecar rather than just Photoshop on the iPad app? So if I'm using Sidecar, one thing that's nice is I'm able to run 2 screens. You get this effect also if you're running any sort of Cintiq with a touch screen. That allows you to work with reference images or do windowed web browsing, look at your script, whether you're working from it. There's a lot of 3D modeling actually available in web browsing these days. I'll talk about that later. They can, pull up as reference images while you're actually working with your drawing screen over here. And then again, there's that keyboard shortcuts thing. So basically, Sidecar allows you to take this drawing screen and then turn your offhand, in my case, my left hand, to this powerful tool that calls up reference images, shortcuts, whatever, at lightning speed. So this is an example of the Photoshop UI, and this is the desktop version. So over on the left, you'll see those are the tools. That's the tool menu. You'll be mainly working in brushes and type and selection. Not a lot of those other tools will be any use to you. And then over there on the right, there's the layers menu. That's key. I'll talk about layers management again later. And then version history. And so I would encourage you to just look up basically a quick drawing tutorial of any program that you want to use, because any of these programs that I'm going to be showing you have their own, communities of people that develop brushes, of styles, et cetera. And there's huge user bases of these. So this is kind of a quick speed through of all this stuff. And you can find a ton more detailed, really granular walkthroughs online, including actually with a lot of these programs, the instant that you load them up, they offer tutorials too. So this is Photoshop's UI. You can see why I would need something like a Bluetooth mouse or something like that to navigate it if I'm using it on my iPad, because there's a ton of tiny buttons. So using Procreate. Procreate is actually built for iPad. It's natively built for the iPad. There's no Mac application, there's no Windows application, there's no Chrome OS application. It's specifically built for iPad sketching. And it started out really simple, and then they've actually built it out to be a relatively full-featured app over the years, to the point where you can actually build professional-grade work where you would be able to turn it into a design director or an editor and get the sign-off. It's also got a really great community around it. Both the app developers are really responsive to the community, and the community itself is like a really excited community of artists that develop cool brushes and do time lapses and stuff like that and share all their stuff. It's also really quick and easy to use. Photoshop has a little bit of a steep learning curve, in part because it's so complicated, because it wasn't built for comics. It was built for a ton of other stuff. It was, it's like the Swiss Army knife of graphics applications. It's also, Procreate is a cheap one-time purchase. It's not a subscription model, which is great. So if you're a young artist on a limited budget and you just want to get used to working digitally and mess around in an app, it's a great one to start out with. And again, there's a ton of tutorials because the user base is awesome. So the cons is that the layer system isn't optimized and it's kind of a little bit difficult to use. It's built for iPad, so it is sort of intuitive to it, but coming from somebody that came from a more complicated system that was built for desktop, I just don't find it strong enough for oftentimes what I'm looking for. It also can't export editable text. This is a biggie for me. So I do these like 175, 200-page books. I can't be exporting documents that don't have editable text. Like if my editor needs me to make a change on page 32 or whatever, I need to be able to get into that document after they talk to me about it and make that change. And so when Procreate spits out PSDs, it rasterizes its text. The text is editable as long as you work inside of Procreate, but when you leave its ecosystem, it shuts it down. And so if you share those files, with your editor and stuff like that, they're no longer editable. It's not a great system. Maybe they'll update it eventually. The community has been asking for it for years, but no sign of it yet. And another big con is that iPad only means that you're reliant on the iPad file management system, which is not great. It's been getting better with every OS update. It gets better, but Apple is frustratingly slow with making the iPad into actually a full-featured device. It's very powerful on its own. It has the computing power, basically, to be one, but it isn't. So this is an example of Procreate's UI. So over there, you can see on the right, the layers menu is a lot more simple than Photoshop's. It's big because it's for the iPad. It's easy to touch in and out of, but the way that it varies layers, it can get really easy to lose track of them. And over there on the left, those big dials control size and transparency. And then up there on the top, really simple, you can see that it was only built for sketching, for comics, for illustration. It only has brushes, it only has layers and eraser, and then a smudge tool, which, I never really use. So then the last one, Clip Studio Paint, is the third major program that the comics community uses. And this has a very passionate community. And Clip Studio Paint has come a long way. It used to be called Manga Studio, and it started out as a Photoshop killer, an attempted take on Adobe Photoshop by people that wanted to draw manga and were using Photoshop and were unhappy with it. And then it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And they've added in a bunch of different features. They renamed it Clip Studio so that to make it clear that it wasn't only for manga. And it's got fantastic stuff built into it. So one of the big pros is that from the ground up, it was built for comics. And at this point, it's a desktop app with features on par with Photoshop, if not more. It's got cloud documents. It's got a good iPad app. It's got 3D models, and that's huge. I'll talk about those in a second, that are really well integrated into the application itself, at least on the desktop version. So you can, render figures and stuff like that and then sketch from them. Again, it's got a good community. Cons, and this is huge, is that it has no editable text output. So again, when you leave the closed garden, export to PSDs, you lose text editability. And so editors will tell you not to work in Clip Studio Paint for that reason. Some people do workarounds that are really elaborate, including, I know cartoonists who basically do all their inking in Clip Studio Paint and then they export it and then import it into Photoshop and then have all the editable text in Photoshop, and they just always send the, they have to do this two-step export dance every time. But basically the hassle is big enough that it's kept me from switching over to Clip Studio Paint. Maybe someday they'll solve it. It seems to be some sort of proprietary thing with Adobe. Otherwise, I can only imagine that these programs would have made it so that you can export editable text. But a ton of people use Clip Studio Paint. I don't use it myself for that reason. I've messed around with it a little bit, but if you're curious about it, it comes really highly recommended. There's some really great tutorials about it. So this is an example of its UI. Again, you can see that it's more complicated than Procreate, which is just an iPad app, but it's a lot less complicated than Photoshop. And you can see that most of the tools that you'll see over there on the left side seem like something that you might be using in comics, whereas most of the tools on the left side in Photoshop, they're icons that you don't really know what they'd be doing because they're for photographers or for making animation or something like that. And so one thing that's really neat about CSP is that it has these integrated 3D models. And this is a really powerful tool. I don't use it myself because, again, I don't use CSP, but I'm actually considering for the inking stage of my next book, downloading and subscribing to CSP just to use this feature. I think they actually bought an old program called Poser that people used to use and then integrated it. but it basically allows you to use this doll, this posable doll, and then you sketch up for it. It's really great. So on that note, with 3D reference models, one of the neat things about digital art now is that 3D models are everywhere. When I started out in 2007, that was not true. There were 3D renders, there was 3D rendering software, but it was expensive and it took a lot of hardware to run. It took a lot of hardware to display. And so if you wanted reference stuff like that, you would look for photos. You would take photos. Then it was still great that you were working digitally because you had the world of Google at your fingertips. But now you have the world of 3D reference libraries at your fingertips. And this is really huge. So two that people use a lot are Sketchfab and TurboSquid, but there's a ton. The one that I use myself is Sketchfab. This is an example of a search for piano on Sketchfab. So if you search for something on one of these 3D library sites, it'll bring up a user-generated, so it's all, it's these models. Some are pay, some are free. All of them, you can rotate them and look at them from different angles. So you can actually check these out and sort of get an idea for the models. Some people just use those and sketch from them in these programs. Other people actually subscribe to things like the Unreal Engine and things like that, and actually download the models and then build whole worlds that they work from. I don't go that far. I just use these as references to figure out how things look at different angles. Another great tool is the face reference angle. So referenceangle.com is really interesting. It basically allows you, so these tools now that I'm going to be talking about are actually AI. So these are artificially intelligence powered search tools. And you can basically rotate these heads in different ways and then tell the AI different things that you might be interested in seeing, like sunglasses, mustache, eyes open, whatever. And then you search and it pulls a bunch of different faces that look like that from the web, basically. And so if you're looking for people to put in the background, something like that, and you just want a bunch of different humans to draw from, it's really easy to find that these days. It's also really easy to find what animals look like these days. So this is another AI-powered search thing that you can basically tell it what animal you're looking for and then move the skull whichever way you want. And then it pulls back images. So this is telling it to look for goats with the skull positioned about there. And it gives you a bunch of pictures. This one doesn't have as handy a thing to remember as referenceangle.com. It's like x6ud.github.io because it's just an experimental AI project. But there's a ton of these out there these days. And so as a digital artist learning how to draw stuff, the world is your oyster. Use all these things, figure out how to draw using reference. Because if you've ever tried drawing a room just from your imagination, or look up a picture of a specific room, like in the 19th century of France or something like that, and then that image that you look up will be far more detailed. Don't just draw that image, use that image then as inspiration for all the fine details that you then bring to your work. So another thing that's really easy to use as a digital artist is SketchUp. This used to be a Google project and they sold it off. It's been around for years. It's basically a really easy way to look at different architectural angles. It has a huge base of models. There are models of almost any building you can think of, almost any city block. You can just search and find them and then rotate it. So if you're thinking about what the Tower of London would look like from this angle because you want to set a thing there, you can find that now. And you can set it up really easily without having to take 4 hours to draw out the perspective sightlines and stuff like that. That's still all useful stuff to know. But you don't not learn that stuff by using tools like this. You don't not learn how to read by being read to. It's something that you acquire as you work in 3D. Like I've gotten better at sketching from the top of my head in 3D after I started using 3D reference all the time, because it just teaches your brain how to look at different angles quicker. Speaking of Google, another big one is, so Google Earth now, if you go into satellite view, and I think it's, you press Control, you can tilt it, and then you can kind of fly around like this in this angle. And almost everywhere is pretty detailed at this point, because they're using satellite images and depth images. And then there's a big user base of people uploading 3D renders of buildings and stuff like that. And so you can just fly around all over the world. And so if you're like, I want an aerial shot of Sydney as my establishing shot of my comic, because you want establishing shots, they're great. You can just type Sydney, Australia into a map, into Google Maps, then zoom into the height you want, get into satellite mode, and then tilt it, and then take a screenshot and draw from there. I mean, these are like tools that 50 years ago, cartoonists were dreaming about. And they're there in your browser window. It's amazing. Again, speaking of Google, the same is true for Google Streets. So you have so much reference. Like people used to have to go to the library to find this stuff. It took ages. And now anywhere, you can just drive through the streets, take reference photos. Like I do this all the time. I take this, take a screenshot of that. Then you go into Photoshop, you start adjusting the perspectives, skew, you take the image itself, you use perspective warps to make it how you want it to, and then you just sketch over really quickly, make it transparent, and then ink on that, bam. It's amazing. Reference photos. So another thing that I constantly do is use my own computer image, my own computer camera, as a reference photo camera. So cartoonists have been doing this basically since photography was available on a widespread level. And it's really fun. You can find reference photos of, that people from like famous newspaper cartoonists used and stuff like that, and all these old archives. It's not cheating. One of the biggest things that people have a hang up about when they first start really trying to get into art is this idea of like purity, and that if it doesn't come out of only your head and your head alone, then it's somehow invalid. But comics take a really long time to do, and they always have. And so cartoonists have always been developing methods for speeding it up. And so if you can take a picture of yourself instead of really thinking hard about the structure of like the skeleton and musculature and stuff like that, do it. It's not cheating. And if you do it a bunch, then you'll learn how to draw that arm, even if you haven't gone to a ton of life drawing classes. This stuff becomes grooves in your brain. And also another fun thing about taking a ton of reference photos of yourself is that because I've been doing this since 2007, I now have this weird time log of myself as I like slowly lose my hair and develop wrinkles and grow beards and lose beards. And I'm out doing all these different poses and stuff like that. So whenever I die, they could do a giant slideshow of this in the background. So the Unreal Engine, I don't use it, but it is really powerful. And there's more and more cartoonists that are using it. The only reason why I don't use tools like this basically is that I'm old enough that I'm starting to have the old dog new tricks thing. Like I'm kind of stuck in Photoshop. I learned it in the 90s and I still use it. But it's worthwhile to learn stuff. And I've watched YouTube videos of cartoonists using Unreal, and it's an amazing tool. So Unreal is a tool that was developed originally to create games, but at this point it's been broadened to have use cases in everything from architecture to art and illustration to animation. It's used in a ton of ways. I mean, it's one of the more powerful, basically 3D rendering and modeling software suites, I guess. I don't really know how to describe it, but it has a huge user community, has a huge base of 3D models that are accessible to you. It's relatively easy to learn, but like with anything, there's a steep learning curve. I haven't spent the time learning it myself, but there's tons of tutorials out there. And if I hadn't a decade ago learned the tools like SketchUp and Photoshop and things like that I use now, I probably would spend about a week learning this. I think it would be worth it. So how do I actually put all these things to work in my process? So again, I almost never use tools in the real world. All of my ideas exist in my brain and pixels. So I start out writing the script in Google Docs or slides. I have big documents of ideas because, again, I work in nonfiction. So I'm always either coming up with ideas for pitches or developing stories that are ongoing and things like that. So I have a bunch of different notes apps. Whenever one of these things gets greenlit, either it's a freelance project or it's a book or it's a comic, whatever, it comes out of the note app and it goes into either Google Docs or slides, depending on who I'm working for. I don't like to work in Google Slides, but one of my biggest clients demands it because it looks like phone screens, which is fair. I prefer to work in Google Docs because, again, it's kind of what I've always scripted in. I scripted in Microsoft Word before that, and then switched to Google Docs when it cloned Word enough that everybody switched. Then next, I thumbnail while editing text down, and I accumulate reference imagery. In the thumbnail stages, I try to get as much like 3D modeling and stuff like that as I can. I get the 3D models and then I thumbnail sketch over them really quick because I want to, when I'm inking, I want to be inking over the thumbnail rather than inking over the 3D reference, because basically every time you work over something digitally, it's almost like a photocopier, like it adds a layer of style to it and it's your own style. And so when you're using something like 3D reference, it's okay to just make it a transparent layer and then sketch over it. But my recommendation with that would be to make it a transparent layer, do the thumbnail sketch over it fast once, and then come back to it later when you're doing the digital inking. And then it's all part of the same, page, same composition that you're all working to at once. So then digital inking layer, and I'm always editing the text further. I basically almost never stop editing until I turn my work in, because comics really demand a level of concision that is found nowhere else except in like radio or poetry. Like the less words, the better, always. You always want to bring your art out because that's, I'll talk about this later, but the word to balance ratio is a real key thing in comics. And so I'm always editing it down and then I finally color the finals. And so after basically writing the script in Google Docs or Slides, which is on my laptop, I switch over to the iPad and I'm essentially working on the iPad after that. And so I always thumbnail in spreads. So this is an example of a thumbnail for my book that's coming out in the fall. I always thumbnail in spreads. You can see me working with an accumulation of reference, of thumbnails, stuff like that. Then I ink individually. So now I chop the spread in half, I ink that page, and then I color it. And those are the three main steps. I used to have a step in between that would be sort of a pencil stage, but I dropped that as I got faster with digital inking. And you can have as many revision stages in between as you want, basically. But keep in mind that you do have to turn something in at some point. And also with digital art, speed is, one of the big things that you're afforded is that you can draw something and then you can move it. You don't have to think really hard about where it's going to happen. So you can kind of be working and keep the composition live, just constantly be moving. One of the big things that's important about digital work is layer management. This is important both personally and professionally. So it's important professionally because when you turn stuff into an editor or a director, they're going to want to have a document that makes sense. So you're going to want to have a document that has everything in clear labels. It has stuff in folders. So if there's any edits that need to be made, they're easy to make. Keep your layers separate. Don't destroy your pixels. So if you have an inking layer, make a layer for coloring underneath that inking layer so that you aren't inking directly onto you aren't coloring directly onto the inks, you aren't losing stuff. That way you can always go back, you can always change things. And personally, layer management is important because as you're going through a huge project, especially with a bunch of different reference images, you're pasting those directly into the document. One of them doesn't work. You take another one, you make that one visible, you cut them in half, you combine them, you rotate them. You've got like 300 layers really quickly. And so figuring out how to group them, how to label them as you're working will actually save you time. And it saves you time both as you're working and then at the end of the project when you're trying to make sense of it when you're all done. A big recommendation I'd have is to make your own fonts. These are all my different fonts. There's several easy to use online services that are always changing. The one I use is called My Fonts, but there's probably better ones at this point. I haven't really checked, and it's been a few years. But a font made from your own handwriting will always match your art style better. Even if you think that your own handwriting is nothing special or anything to write home about, like imagine that you're writing the fanciest thank you note to your grandma or something like that. Like you got to be able to write really well when you think about it. And all these services, basically, you're writing like the A, the B, the C. It's easy to do. Look it up online. If you make several, you can use them for different purposes.
Andy, so I have small question. So how do you make your own fonts?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of online services. So myfonts.com is the one I used, but there's a lot. And then there's actually paid. So some of them are free. Some of them are cheap, like $10 a font. And then there's also really complicated ones that are actual software suites where you can then go in and edit the vectors and stuff like that. But there are really easy to use, foolproof ones. Myfonts.com, I think, was this one. But I use them for all sorts of different purposes: annotating maps, diagrams, indicating different character voices, creating a title or body font hierarchies, and having a few on hand is good for creating different sound effects within your work that all have the same visual feel because they all come from you. So like all of these were made by me. They all make sense in a page that's drawn by me. And there's great digital fonts out there. You should use those too if you don't want to spend the time for this, but I think it's worth it. It takes like a day. So here's some quick tips and tricks because I know we're getting close to the end. So don't, and I know I've said this already, but don't feel bad about using reference images or any shortcut you figure out. What matters is the art you end up making, not the process you made it with. All professional comic artists use reference photos or 3D models. There is no cheating. This is really true. And like, if you actually look at, Twitter feeds of professional artists, they complain about this all the time because like, people in amateur communities and like DeviantArt or whatever it is, it's what it was when I was growing up. I'm sure it's different. People would attack each other all the time for, I can see you using 3D models, stuff like that. That's learning. That's like how you learn this stuff. Like you use these tools until they become part of your brain. So never let anybody make you feel bad about any shortcut. Working fast is the point. So another big one is think about how people will read your comic. So do you expect people to read your comics on a phone screen, on a computer screen? Both kinds of screens, they're really different. Like one's really big and the other one's really little. So that affects words. So like if a comic is designed for a computer screen, it can become really hard to read on a phone screen. Are you planning to print it now? Are you planning to print it in the future? Plan for all of this before thumbnailing, before you commit to any form. Think about how it's going to end up. And there's a lot of different ways. You can design stuff that can be read on both a phone screen and a computer screen. If you design for phone first and accept having it blown up kind of big for the computer screen or maybe centered, or at the nib or a few other places, they actually develop their own custom software that rearranges the panels. And there's all sorts of complicated things, but you got to think about it. And plan for it. And actually, it affects things like panels. Like you can't use as many panels on a phone screen as you can on a page. On a page, you have a page break. On a phone screen, you have a scroll. It thinks about, that affects narrative. That affects the way that the reader deals with the story. So another thing is get the specs from your editor or director. Digital art is easier to change than traditional art, which is awesome, but it's still a hassle, especially if you're on deadline and you have a bunch of projects. If you're trying to freelance, you're on a book deadline, whatever. If you're getting paid or commissioned, figure out the size and the resolution you'll be expected to turn in. You don't want to get cut out, especially if you draw something too small. It's hard to upsize sometimes if you're working in pixels and you don't want to have to redraw stuff. So know your color space. If you're working for print, it's in CMYK. If you're working for a screen, it's in RGB. These are big differences. And if you just shift from one to the other, your colors will look muddy. So if you're going to be working for print, design for print, and then figure out the screen. But you want to have those big, vibrant, nice print colors. And there's a lot of online tutorials about this stuff. But before you jump in, know your specs. Another thing to learn about is anti-aliasing. So any digital program, anti-aliasing is something to consider. On the left is an anti-alias line. You can see that it has a sort of smooth edge. So this is zooming in way far. Those are actual pixels that you're seeing, that grid. On the right is an alias line, which is a hard edge. And so it's sort of counterintuitive, but people often recommend using an alias line rather than an anti-alias, even though it looks sharper to your eye, because it's easier to color to. You can just drop paint bucket in there and it doesn't catch up anything on the edge where it blurs. But there's certain use cases where anti-alias lines do look better, like if you're working just in black and white, things like that, or in just one single color. There's a lot of different, but remember, this is a big thing. And there's always a checkbox in your digital tools, and it makes the programs treat your art output differently. Another big thing is that stylus pressure matters. So unless you're using a fixed line style, all of these tools have pressure in them. Even the cheapest bamboo tablet is a pressure tablet now. And so things get heavier as gravity draws them down. And visually as an artist, the easiest way to depict that is to actually thicken the line. This is the classic thing. You know, the ball you press harder as you draw the bottom. You can see it there on the left or on the right. I'm pressing harder as I draw the chin, as I draw the bottom of the nose, as I draw the hair. And so use that with your stylus. Just because you're drawing digitally doesn't mean that you can pretend that you don't know that pressure matters. It still matters. Another big thing about comics is that comics break up ideas into panels. It's just how the visual language works. It's our biggest power. It makes us able to present information in a narrative sequence that is really easily digestible. It's what makes comics so fun to read, so easy to convey information. But think about your panels. Think about how you're breaking up the ideas. It's almost like paragraphs or sentences, stuff like that. Like there's a lot of different metaphors, but basically they're units of information. And so because of those units of information, you got to start thinking about graphic design. And grids are a big part of comics. They always have been. You don't have to use them, but you have to know that they're there because people will see them even if they're not there. And so using different grids, again, you got to think about where this is going. On a computer screen, you could use a grid that has 3 panels across. On a phone screen, that gets kind of cramped, maybe a grid that only has 1 or 2. In a book, how big is your book? Whatever, but grids can be broken up into all these different ways. Humans love grids because they organize things. They don't necessarily need to look like the grid that is underlying the grid. As you can see, the top one is a 3x3 grid. Down below, you can see the 3x3 grid under there, but it's all disguised, etc. Another big graphic design thing that you should always remember in comics is the rule of 3. So it's this weird thing about human brains where we see focal points in compositions. And this is a big thing in classical art. Pages and panels look best when you divide them into a 3x3 grid and then plan your layout and design based on it. You don't have to do this. Again, you don't have to do these things, but you have to know about them and then consciously not do them if you're not going to do them. So the places where the lines cross are the focal points in this layout. So this is either a page or a subdivided page of a panel. All these things are just the way that the human brain focuses on a composition. So you can use this technique to create a sense of motion. So down there on the bottom, you can see I'm using the rule of 3 to guide the eye from the top left in a Z along that hillside, back to the guy chasing the other guy, and then out of the page. You can use it to convey emotion. You can see that I'm using the rule of 3 to draw the reader's eye down from that darkened part of the top page to where the focus is down in the bottom left. Or scene, where I'm using this very dynamic band scene, but if you look at where the focal points are, the guitarist is on a focal point, the singer is on the focal point, and then the bottom 2/3 is where the two kind of protagonist heads appear. So think about the rule of 3, think about grids, just keep them in your mind, keep them in your sketches, and it'll become natural to you as you start thumbnailing a lot. A traditional way to talk about comics is that they're words and pictures, but a thing that I've always liked as a better descriptor, I don't know who came up with it, I think it might have been James Sturm, is that they're more graphic design and poetry. And that's because poetry demands an incredible economy of language. You always need to be cutting and figuring out how to say this perfect idea in as few words as possible. And graphic design, because you're basically taking a reader and guiding them through an experience that the reader controls. So that means that you need to do a lot of things like think about the Z, the underlying grid. But it also means that you have this whole tool set available to you that is traditionally available to graphic designers that integrates really well into comics. So infographics integrate really well into comics. Schematics and cutaways integrate really well into comics. Charts and data visualizations integrate really well into comics. So do timelines, maps, inset panels. These are all things that come from the world of graphic design that because you're essentially working as a narrative graphic designer, you have access to use. So another big thing is that comics demand brevity. So the panel on the left is alienating, the panel on the right is not. Essentially, if you go more than half of a panel in words, readers won't read it. It's this weird thing where if readers come across a page of text and an image, they'll prefer the image. But if they come across a page that's mostly text and a little image, it stops being comics to them. So you always want to kind of keep the level of words at about 1/3 and 1/2 if you need to. Don't ever let it really take over the panel. Stay on top of technology. So I'm 37 years old and I've had to relearn a lot of things in my life, but it's always worth it. There's incredibly exciting things happening right now. So the Unreal Engine that I talked about is developing this project called the MetaHumans Project, where they're basically using, again, AI to develop these human avatars that you can just like control the features of in all these different ways and then pose them. And it's very early technology. You can go look up videos, but there's tools coming down the pipeline that have already, tools have already profoundly changed their industry. And there's more tools coming down the pipeline that will change it in even more profound ways. And it's sort of incumbent on you, if you want to be a working professional, to stay on top of the tools that are being used in your field. Yeah, you got to stay on top of the wheel or the wheel will run you over. And then the last thing that I'm going to leave you with is learn how to end things, especially if you're just starting out. Start short and finish projects. This is really huge. So everybody has a dream project, and that's important. That's what made you want to get into the arts in the first place. But you need to kill that dream project, basically, or at least put it off. Don't let that dream project be the first thing that you try, because you don't want to end up hating it. What you want to do is you want to kind of learn how to build a house by learning how to lay a brick. And so comics are a narrative art, right? They're these storytelling units. So if you think about a novel, a lot of times parts of that novel have been excerpted in like magazines or newspapers before. It's essentially like almost pieces of short stories that are cobbled together into a longer novel. So that person figured out how to write those short stories first. That's like learning how to write the brick. So learn how to write short comics, learn how to finish them before you try tackling longer stuff. Because ending things, learning how to end things is as big a skill as any other skill. It's as big a skill as drawing. It's as big a skill as graphic design, is learning how to let go, learning how to turn something in. And when it's good enough to step away and start doing something else. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great, great. We love it. We love it. Thank you very much, Andy. So I think we still have 30 minutes to go. So if you guys have any question, or if you please could show us some like demonstration or live drawing using your equipment, please.
Yeah, let's do a Q&A, and then I could try doing that. The issue, I might have to set it up using external, using my phone, because I can't screen share because I'm using like a iPad. I was trying to do it this morning, but I could film myself. I could show that, but let's do a Q&A first if anybody has any.
Great, thank you. So can you please have a look at the chat, please, Andy?
Okay, where is it? Let's see. Chat. Okay. Oh goodness, I haven't even been reading this. Okay. Where do you get inspiration and creative ideas for your projects? Okay, so like I said, I work in nonfiction. And one of the most exciting things about nonfiction is that basically your creative tool set is the world. And it's almost like if you think about sculpture. So if you're working in fiction, it's additive sculpture. You're putting pieces of clay or silly putty or whatever on this thing until it looks like a human head. If you're working in nonfiction, you're starting out with this block of wood or this block of stone, and you're kind of cutting things away. It's subtractive sculpture. It's the opposite of additive sculpture. And so with nonfiction, there's like so many exciting things in the world that I have ideas until I die and then some already in my notes app. And I have more all the time, because as I listen to podcasts, actually, while I'm working, while I'm inking and stuff like that, if I come across an idea, something like that I hadn't heard of, I'll pause it, write it down, and then forget about it. And then periodically I'll organize things. And so some of my books often are my history books. I wrote a history of utopias. My book that's coming out in September is a sort of way of telling history through human-animal domestication. Basically, the world is really fascinating, and the whole world is really fascinating. And one of your jobs as an artist is to convey why it's fascinating to other people, because you want them to be fascinated in your work. And with nonfiction, I'm like, this is really interesting, look at this. And then I have to explain to them why it's interesting. So it's actually not very hard for me to be inspired or find ideas, because there's too many. I mean, it's sort of narrowing down and organizing the ideas. That's the interesting part to me. And again, that's not hard either. I spend a lot of my time doing that as I go for walks. I walk, I garden, those are my hobbies. And as I do those, they're very quiet activities. I'm sort of in my head and I organize information that I already know. Okay. How do you manage creative burnout, especially if it is a passion project? Yeah, I mean, it's hard. So one thing that I think is important actually is to always be doing several things. So I am never working on just one project at once. That's important professionally too, because I mean, I'm a millennial. I'm an old millennial, but I'm a millennial. And so that means that I graduated into a global financial crisis and bought a house right before global pandemic and second financial crisis. I mean, it's been an awful time. So I've never lived in a world where there's sort of a professional, stable life like there used to be. And so having a bunch of different projects going on is a safe thing too. I mean, I've had projects explode out from under me, things like that. So I always have a couple books going, a couple freelance things. So whenever I start getting burned out on one, I can switch rails. That helps. But subject matter actually affects that too. So my third book that I did, a book called Spring Rain, was very difficult for me to work on. It was long. It's a memoir. It's the only memoir I've written. And it was personally difficult. It was about a dark time in my life, and it made me depressed, and it was hard to work on. Whereas my first book and the book about animal domestication were very joyful and easy to work on. And I worked on the memoir book because it was important to me and it was kind of haunting me, and I felt like I needed to do it. But there's a cost to the subject matter. And so if you choose to work on subject matter that is difficult to think about, remember that you're going to be thinking about it for 8 hours a day because it's your job. And this is actually a thing that I teach a class at Stanford, the Stanford Graphic Novel Project, where the students pick a topic together and then all work together on making one graphic novel throughout a 2-quarter class. It's a really cool project. It's collaborative and stuff like that. And they always want to, pick something really important but heavy. Like, I don't know, like one time they wanted to do like, it was like Korean comfort women during the Second World War, like really, intense topics. And you tell them like, this is something that you'll have to be drawing and thinking about all the time when you're working on it. And so that, I'm not saying just draw clouds and happy stuff, but your work is your life if you choose to make it that. And if you choose to become a professional artist, then your work is your life. And so what kind of work you do affects that. But how do I manage it? I mean, like I said, I go for walks, I garden, I get outside. I have 2 kids, and that really helps too, having like a family that isn't part of the art. My wife works and has always had a 9-to-5 job. And so even though I've always had a freelance life, I've always structured my work life around her, basically. So when she left, I started work. When she came home, I stopped work, and then I never worked on the weekends. And that's true still with my family. And with working on books or as a freelancer, you can have this creep into your personal life. I mean, this is true for everybody in the pandemic now, but where it can be hard to demarcate that. And that was something that always helped me. I mean, it's not the healthiest thing to recommend, like find somebody else and base your life around them, but it did. I mean, somehow finding something that wasn't art, that wasn't, just like working all the time, because I do that naturally. As I love comics, I love drawing all the time. That's why I do this, but left to it, I will only do it. And so finding ways to stop myself from doing it was important too. So how did I get started? And how do I feel now that I got to this point? Okay, how I got started. I always loved drawing comics. I grew up, I had a weird childhood, bouncing around from place to place, living on a bunch of different small islands. My dad is a marine biologist, and we lived in a field. And a constant of it was that they would always read comics to us. My mom read us French comics to teach us French, and my dad always read us newspaper comics. And so I grew up loving comics, but when I was like, and I always said I would be a cartoonist, like when I was a kid. And then when I was a teenager, I got away from it and decided it wasn't for me, because I thought you couldn't make money in the arts, because that's the thing that you hear a lot. But it's the 21st century. You can't make money doing anything anymore, so you might as well draw. But anyway, so I came back to it when I basically realized in college that it was the one thing that really fascinated me. I could have done a lot of stuff. I don't think it's a real thing when artists say that I could never do anything else, because I'm a digital artist. Like if I was living in the Bronze Age, I would obviously not be a digital artist. I would be like hammering bronze. So you can always do other stuff. It's what you choose. And I chose comics because it was incredibly fascinating, because every time you work on a page of comics, it presents this level of complexity that I didn't find in something like academia, which was the other thing that I was really doing. I kind of went from academia to comics, because every page that you encounter is a problem of graphic design to be solved. It's a problem of style to be learned. It's a problem of narrative storytelling to figure out how to link into this longer chain. And then each of the actual elements of the craft required that go into that page, the thumbnailing, the layouts, the writing, all this stuff. I mean, it's just a really, really complicated art form. And I loved it. It just fascinated me. So I did it more and more. And I worked as a graphic designer for a while. And I liked that too, but I just always kept making comics. And then I eventually, like I said, the financial crash happened 2 years into my career as a graphic designer. I lost all my clients. And so I took the plunge and went to the comic school in Vermont, the Center for Cartoon Studies, got a master's degree there. And it was there that I actually realized that nonfiction was my strong suit. I'd done a little bit of nonfiction before that, but I'd done mainly fiction, and I did a couple nonfiction comics there, and the reaction that I got in the community showed me that it was something I should really pursue. And then I started freelancing while I was still in school, actually, selling comics about selling comics to Slate, actually. So it's really early, like freelance work, and then work led to work, and then eventually a book happened, and then books led to books, and then you start teaching, and then there you go. There's no real path that you can talk about in terms of something that people can follow anymore as a path to the arts. And I'll give you an example why. So my first book, Brief Histories of Everyday Objects, came about because I made a mini comic. And then I made a mini comic of this web cartoon series that I'd done immediately after graduating from comic school. I was like, I got to figure something out. I'm going to make an idea. The idea was to make the most basic, think of the most boring things I could, and then make them interesting. So it was stuff like toilet paper and showers and things like that. I made it into a webcomic. A few people looked at it, but it didn't take off. And so I made it into this little mini comic and forgot about it. And literally 2 years later, after I had ended this comic, the mini comic, I had worked with a distributor to distribute it around a few comic shops in the US. And it was in this comic shop in New York. I live in the Bay Area on the other side of the continent. And an editor walked down the street from their offices in the Flatiron building to the nearest comic shop because they were bored and wanted to expand their line of graphic novels a little bit, and picked up this mini comic and then emailed me out of the blue. So there's not, and I thought it was a prank at first. And it's hard to, like, the only kind of advice you can really give to aspiring people is to get yourself out there. There's no like there used to be a path in the arts. You would go with your portfolio to the magazine editors on Wednesday, or you would do this, or you would do that. And that doesn't exist anymore. But the exciting thing is that because that doesn't exist anymore, the doors are actually wider open than they used to be. So that path was also gatekeeping. That path also kept people out. And so now what you need to do is just get yourself out there. And the paths for that is the world entire. I mean, it's digital. It's get your art online, get your art on Twitter, get your art on Behance, get your art on Facebook. It's physical, make zines, make comics, mail them to people, mail them places. I think you can buy my books as ebooks. I believe so, yeah. But yeah, just get your stuff out there. And I mean, it's like sending out fishing lines. Like, you never know what'll come back. And expecting any given one to be the line that pulls will make you depressed and sad. So finish things, don't get attached to the things that you finish, and then put them out there for other people to experience. And eventually some of them might come back to you. And when they do, jump on it. I mean, all of this is knowing what an opportunity is and jumping on it and being incredibly nice to the person that presented you with it, and being gracious and being easy to work with. And I say that as somebody that has both been an editor, and so I've been the person on the other side of this, and also has done a bunch of books and worked with a bunch of editors and art directors. My success as a freelancer, and then my later success as a book author, is entirely due to the fact that I am very nice and easy to work with. People tell me this after they work with me. If you are nice to your editors and easy to work with, you will get more work, and they'll recommend you to other people. If you're trying to make your life as a freelancer, don't burn your bridges. And sometimes that entails like having interactions that you don't want to have. Like, you get angry and then you have to take a day before you reply to that email, and it's on you, and that sucks because you're the less powerful person in this interaction, because your editor always has more power than you. But it's figuring that out and being nice, being easy to work with. So my experience with getting a master's degree in cartooning was great. It was a leap of faith, but it paid off. It doesn't always pay off. I know other people that went to that same school, my same class, and are not professional cartoonists. I also know other people in my same class that were. It's like any professional degree. It's you also, like any professional degree, you get out what you put in. So if you decide to do something like a comics program, go all in. I mean, throw yourself into it, and don't just throw yourself into it thinking, I love drawing comics, I want to go to a program that lets me draw comics. Think about it like this, like you're going to a program that is specifically there to turn you into a working cartoonist. Use that. One of the biggest things is critiques. So you will have access to this group of people who are telling you what's good and bad about your art in like a honest and open way, and teachers and professionals. That's huge. Like critiques is where I learned that I was good at nonfiction. It's where I learned how to use line weight in my comics, all this stuff. And then also just the volume of work that you would do in a program like that. And ending things, again, is really important. So having to finish assignments and turn them in, I cannot stress enough how much of a skill ending things is. Because if you're just left to work on your own, oftentimes you start your dream project, you get 5 pages into it, you get distracted, you start another dream project, you get 5 pages into it, you get distracted, you fiddle with it, etc. Like having to turn stuff into people really does help. All of that said, this is all stuff you can do on your own. And there are tons of cartoonists that do. In fact, cartoonists that are educated through the system are at this point still a minority of working cartoonists, but it's an option. If you go to a comic school with a strong sense of professionalism and you're like, I'm going to make this into my career, you will probably come out of it and be able to be a working cartoonist. It's a big industry. And there's a lot of schools now. There's schools in Europe. I teach at a school in Denmark called the Animation School. There's another school in France. There's several schools in the States, and there's others outside of that. It's a big system at this point, and if you're interested in it, I recommend that you pursue it, but it doesn't have to be for everybody. It is expensive. Some places offer scholarships. CCS, the place I do, has a yearly scholarship. But yeah, anyway, it's out there. So freelancers usually have their high and low points. How do you manage the low one, especially at the time of COVID? Yeah, again, having multiple projects helps because you can switch rails and keep busy. Having things that aren't work helps. Again, family, friends, other projects that aren't art. I don't really have hobbies per se because I I sort of have a part of myself that I turn on and it works, and that's like the part that people would use to like build models and stuff, and I only can use that to draw comics. But I do stuff like gardening or walking that involves like almost this busy work of my hands. So doing that really does help. Taking breaks, getting up, working near a window really helps. It can be lonely. Figuring out how to solve that is important. COVID, ironically, changed that because my wife started working from home. So now I'm actually less lonely than I was before COVID, unlike a lot of other people. But one way that I solved that before that happened was I maintained a studio that was a garden shed in my friend's backyard. And he also worked from home inside of his house. So we were sort of like co-workers almost. Like he was running a business outside of his house. And so we would share the same kitchen and bathroom. But I know a lot of other cartoonists actually maintain studio spaces away from their homes. And it's because of that. It's not because you can't work from your dining room table. Of course you can. It's to demarcate a workspace and make it separate, but also have a place to go to and people that you see on the way. And that can be important for mental health. Yeah. And I don't know, being kind to yourself too is important. You'll always be harder on yourself than anybody else will. But creativity has its highs and lows. It is always going to be a roller coaster, and especially in a longer project, that can be something that is always going to be to some degree difficult to manage. So you will always hate what you work on at some point as you're working on it, and that's okay. Everybody does. So every movie that you see, every book that you read, the creator has hated it at some point. They've loved it too, but I mean, the same thing is true with anything in life. I mean, relationships, children, you love and hate everything, but with your own work, hating it is fine. And it's just the ability to push through it, to find some other aspect to work on or find some other part of it. And to get to the point where you can finish it, because finishing things is important. If you can't finish things, it is okay. There is always value to moving forward and acquiring skills through that. I mean, drawing is drawing. If you draw, you get better at drawing. If you lay out a page, you get better at laying out a page. If you draw and lay out 20 pages and then you abandon that, it is okay. That's 20 more pages in your brain that you're getting better at. But you didn't get better at ending something. And that is worth it. But yeah. Anyway, let me see. What is my ultimate goal in life? I don't know. I like doing this stuff. I don't think I have things that I want to see happen sort of personally. Like I want to, have a good relationship with the people that I'm close to, my family, my parents, my wife, my children, my friends. I want to put out work that I'm proud of. And, I want to move the world around me to a better place, but there's no like hill that I'm trying to get on top of. I love to draw and I love to draw comics and I get to do that and that's fine. I have a lot of projects in my head and if I have a chance to make them, that would be great. But if I get hit by a truck, it's not a big deal. There's not I don't know. It's sort of the work is its own reward in a way, like the drawing comics is a wonderful, complex and amazing thing. And I find the world very fascinating and interesting. And it's an incredible privilege that I have developed a skill set that lets me share that with other people. And so it's a privilege to be able to do that. And I feel lucky too. And I try to reflect that in my life, I guess. Yeah.
So any question, guys? Any more questions? So I think, yeah.
How do you deal with trying not to compare your work to others? Well, you always will, and that's fine too. I mean, it's similar to the idea of hating your own work. Like there's a lot of negative things that are tied up in the world of the arts, of like this idea that you're using, you're cheating, you're using shortcuts. You can see that it's drawn digitally. This isn't as good as that. I'm never going to get better. There's a lot of stuff to kind of get your head wrapped up in, and it's just not worth it. I mean, other people's work should be inspiring to you. As you look at it, you should see techniques in it that you never thought of yourself, and then actually try to replicate those. And at first it might look like how they draw things or how they do things. And then after you draw it 10 times, it'll look like a totally weird version that's a mixture of your way of doing things and theirs. And that's actually how I learned how to draw comics, is I had this very cartoony, simple, goofy style that I'd been drawing in forever, and I never really developed it. And when I was like 24 or 25, and I thought that I really wanted to get serious about this, because like I said, I tried some stuff and it was what really I kept coming back to. I decided to teach myself how to draw better. And I looked at these cartoonists that I really loved their work. These guys I'd grown up with, like Joe Sacco and Alison Bechdel and Jaime Hernandez, these like giants of American alternative cartooning that I'd always loved. And you know what I did? I photocopied a bunch of their pages and I put them in a binder, and then I like traced them. Because this was before I knew how to scan and use Photoshop even. I traced them. I traced them over and over again because I was like, the way this character is turning is really interesting. And, you know, I didn't use those in my comics, but from those, I learned how to frame a scene, how to turn a head, how to do these things. And now my art style is this kind of it's this mashup of like realism with cartooniness. And, you know, I've found my own voice. I draw the way I draw. I still actually doodle in this very different cartoony style that I've had since I was a kid. But I worked on this style and I developed it, and it was an intentional thing, and it came from copying people. And it came by looking at other people, and instead of being aghast that my drawing was not as good as theirs, being inspired enough to copy them. Because that's what copying is. It's being inspired by something else and being like, I want to do that. What's wrong about copying is then presenting it as your own. Copying it and then being like, I made that. That's not what I'm talking about. Don't post stuff that you copy. Copy it, figure out how it works, break it, take it apart, put it back together, then do it in your own style, then post that.
So I think this is the end of this beautiful workshop, Andy. I would like to thank you for this
of course.
effective workshop. It was informative, fruitful, full of useful tips. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your contribution at Arts for a Cause, Andy. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you again after 7 years, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been so long. Let's not make it 7 years again.
Until we meet again, inshallah. Until we meet again.
Thank
you very much.
Bye-bye.
And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. See you soon. Goodbye.